Hi Lorraine. All right, we are going to start on civil rights, go through the next two sections so that you can get on to studying the practice tests. Starting with civil rights and Jim Crow. If you remember the Jim Crow laws we talked about were all of those horrible laws that were passed in the South after the Civil War. They were in place to keep black people from having any rights, to participating in anything in society or government, everything that made it harder on black people in the South after the Civil War. And unfortunately, it went on until the 50s and 60s, 1950 and 60. So it went on for a long time until the Civil Rights, actually until the Civil Rights Act wiped out some of it, made it a little bit better. So Jim Crow are the segregation laws. So you need to have those together if you don't have a definition from earlier. They were referred to as Jim Crow. That's not a specific person. It was actually a weird cartoon thing that was negative towards black people, and it was used to refer to them. So they're called Jim Crow laws. They are segregation laws, and they had been in effect for a century. So in 1954, things changed when the Supreme Court unanimously declared separate but equal in schools to be unconstitutional. That's a very, very important Supreme Court ruling. It's called Brown v. Board of Education. Okay, and what was important about that is that until that point, the South was segregated. So blacks had their own schools, whites had schools, restaurants, everything was separate. And the reason that that was legal is that earlier it had been determined by the Supreme Court that as long as it was equal, everybody was being treated the same, it could still be separate and would be fair. Of course, in the South, it was separate. It was absolutely not equal. The schools were not as good. Everything that the black people had to use was not as good as what the white people had. So everybody knew that. So it was separate but equal was not working, and it wasn't until Brown v. Board of Education, the Supreme Court said that's not okay. Separate but equal is unconstitutional in schools. So you can't, that's when the integration of schools began, and there were riots and terrible things happening after that. But that was what started the idea that you could integrate the schools, that black children and white children could go to school together. It wasn't as easy as just passing a law, but that was the beginning. So the goal of the civil rights leaders differed, and you do need to know some of the differences on how they viewed trying to gain rights. Martin Luther King wanted a harmonious blending of the races. He wanted people to get along in society. He worked towards that goal with a lot of peaceful demonstrations. Other names you'll hear about and you need to know are Malcolm X. He called for black separation, that blacks should be separate from whites. He was more radical. Despite the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which declared discrimination to be illegal, it still took many, many, many years for civil rights leaders to actually make gains in this struggle for liberty for the black people. And of course, it still goes on today. There's always racism and problems. But that was an important point. So here's what you need to know about the 20th century civil rights leaders. These are the specific people you should recognize their names. Okay, Booker T. Washington, and I do think we've talked about some of this earlier on. Around the 1900s, he believed that African Americans should gradually gain their rights, and he's the one that had the Atlanta Compromise. I know we've talked about this. In the Atlanta Compromise, he told mostly white audience that African Americans would work with their hands and they would accept a subservient or lesser role in society in exchange for being recognized with some basic equality and education rights. Kind of trying to ease in and say, we're going to work really hard, and in return, we'd like a little help here with education and some basic rights. He became the first head of the Tuskegee Institute in 1881. And at that institute, students gained skills necessary to succeed as part of the labor force. So he was saying, we want to be a part of the labor force. This was in the early 1900s. To be a part of the labor force and integrate and be able to make a living working in society. Another one is Webb Du Bois. It's W-E-B and then DUBOIS, and that's around 1910. He disagreed with Booker Washington's gradual rights ideology. He didn't want the idea that you kind of slowly work your way into society if you're black. He sponsored the Niagara movement, and that called for desegregation and absolute equality right now. So Webb wanted equality for blacks immediately. Right? Makes sense. Another one is Marcus Garvey, Garvey, around 1920, and that's a name we also did talk about a little bit, so some of this might be familiar. He was the leader of the Back to Africa, the colonization that we talked about. It was the movement that encouraged blacks to return to their ancestors, the land of their ancestors. So now that they weren't slaves anymore, that they should be colonized and taken back to Africa and given a place and put back there with it. So the problem is, of course, that's very difficult to do, and most of the black people that were here, a lot of them had been born here, they had been born into slavery. Now that they were free, somebody was wanting to send them back. Rosa Parks, very important. I'm pretty sure you've heard this name. In 1955, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white person on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. And that was the law, is that black people had to give up seats to white people. And she refused. She was tired. She was, I can't remember, I think she was older, tired. She'd been working all day. She was on the bus, and she didn't want to have to give up her seat to the first white person that came along and wanted it. So she refused, and she was arrested for not giving up her seat to a white person. It sounds so crazy to us now, but that is the way it was. That then inspired the blacks to boycott the bus system and to protest segregation. So it was one of the times that the black people said, we're not going to take this. It inspired them. And of course, when you boycott a company or a group or something, it usually costs them money, and then you get their attention, and then you can negotiate, kind of like with the unions. When people strike, then you get their attention. So in this case, they boycotted and protested segregation, the idea that she had to give up her seat because the blacks and whites had different parts of the bus, and she was sitting in what would be the white section. It was the Montgomery bus boycott, and it ended about a year later when the Supreme Court declared segregation on buses unconstitutional. So it started a movement. It inspired people to stand up and say, we're not going to take this, and we're going to boycott. If we can't ride the buses the same way everyone else can, and we have to be segregated, then we're not going to support the bus system. And that does cause problems. And finally, a year later, the Supreme Court declared segregation on buses unconstitutional. Martin Luther King Jr., 1960, you should know him. He was a national figure in the Montgomery bus boycott. He was outspoken for civil rights. He supported civil disobedience, which means you can be disobedient if you believe that something is not being done correctly in your community, your government, but you're doing it in a civil way. He did not promote or he didn't believe in violence. He believed in passive resistance. He delivered the very famous I Have a Dream speech in 1963, which I'll cover a little bit more detail. I want you to know these names. So we will talk about that. Stokely Carmichael is another name. Carmichael, Carmichel. Around 1965, he was the leader of the Black Panthers and the Black Power movement. That was a little more edgy movement, the Black Panthers and Black Power. They wanted immediate civil rights for blacks to separate into their own communities. The Black Panther Party was co-founded by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. So if you hear the name Black Panther, think of Huey Newton, Newton, and Bobby Seale, Seale. They wanted the black people to have more power and to separate into their own groups. Malcolm X, 1962, was a member of the Nation of Islam. He preached black supremacy and separation of blacks and whites. He felt that the black people were supreme over the white people and that they should be separate. but he was also a member of the Nation of Islam. The Freedom Riders, 1961. Young white and black civil rights advocates rode buses together in the segregated South. They were confronted with violence. In Montgomery, Alabama, in Mississippi, they were arrested for breaking segregation laws. It was illegal for blacks and whites to mingle, to go into the places that were reserved for just blacks or just whites, and it was illegal for both to do that. So when people were breaking those laws intentionally to show that they were unfair and that people should be able to go wherever they want, they would get arrested, and that would then get more attention until that's kind of what you want after a while, is just to get enough attention on it. The SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or CORE, Congress of Racial Equality. Those were student organizations. There were a lot of college students who were getting involved, seeing that the South especially was very unfair when it came to race relations. And they were college students, and they were involved in many of the activities, including the Freedom Rides, which was riding wherever we want on the buses, sit-ins, which is where you go someplace you're not supposed to be legally, and you sit in and stay there. African Americans were sitting inside segregated restaurants where only whites were allowed, so the blacks would go sit at those restaurants, and they would be joined by other people, college students, others who agreed with them, and there would be like a mass sit-in. Basically, they're just sitting, taking over a place. To get the attention, to show that, look, we can stay here. This is, shouldn't be able to make us leave. So it was illegal, and it was legal locally in all of those areas. It was legal before the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Once we had an actual Civil Rights Act in 1964, many of these things were legal. And the Civil Rights Act of 1964 stopped those. It didn't always change how people were treated, but it stopped it from being legal to do that. Okay, some people you need to know, other people. Jackie Robinson. Jackie Robinson was a Brooklyn Dodger baseball player, and he was the first African American to play in the Major League Baseball in over 60 years. There were a few African Americans in the early 1880s, but then there was a very long period of time where it was all white. So this triggered a movement to integrate other sports as well, because most of the sports were white. So this started kind of a movement of black athletes. So Jackie Robinson is known for being the first major African American player in Major League Baseball. All right. An important name to know. Definitions, I think you have this on your Supreme Court cases, but some of these Supreme Court cases are very important and they will come up. Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, and that's Plessy v. Ferguson, Ferguson. To understand segregation, you need to think about 1896. Homer Plessy, you see the Plessy in the action, was part African American, but he sat in a whites-only railroad car. So he was challenging the Separate Car Act of Louisiana, which segregated blacks from whites on trains. The Supreme Court decided that separate but equal didn't violate the protection of the 14th Amendment. That's where they said, well, hey, as long as they're equal, what's wrong with being separate? So separate but equal meant that African Americans and whites could be separate as long as the facilities, the places they were using, the facilities that they had were the same. But of course they weren't. So Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, is where the Supreme Court said, no, it's okay to be separate and to have laws and rules that keep you from going in places because you're not the color that they say they want you to be in that place, blacks in one, whites in the other, as long as they're all fair. As if you're going to one bathroom, it's as nice as the other bathroom, or one school as good as the other school. So they said that that's legal. The problem is, of course, that those places were not equal. They were not fair. The black communities, the schools, everything they had, they were not as good. So it wasn't fair. So in the Jim Crow South, that meant separate bathrooms, schools, drinking fountains, and restaurants until about 1954. So there's a lot of years of all in the South of blacks and whites being separated by law. Kind of creepy. All right, so another Supreme Court ruling is the one we talked about earlier, Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, 1954. And if you only know a half a dozen court cases, this would be one to know. Brown v. Board of Education, everyone knows it as the landmark case that ended segregation in the schools. It made it now illegal to do that. You could no longer say that you could no longer have schools just for blacks, just for whites, and say that they could not integrate. The Warren Court, the reason if you sometimes hear the Warren Court is that Chief Justice Earl Warren was the Chief Justice at the time. So sometimes they say the Warren Court, whoever was in charge at the time. They declared that separate but equal was unequal, that it was just by nature, it was inherently unequal because it was impossible to make it equal. That it violated the protection clause of the 14th Amendment, which earlier Plessy v. Ferguson said no, it didn't. As long as they're separate but they're equal, it's all good. That was in 1896. In 1954, Brown v. Board of Education said no, it's inherently not equal. If you cannot keep things separate and keep them fair, so it does violate the equal protection of the 14th Amendment. Remember, the 14th Amendment was after the Civil War, and it guaranteed equal protection. So it says that it violated that. So Thurgood Marshall, later a Supreme Court justice, argued on behalf of Linda Brown and other African American children who were denied integration. They were denied the right to go to school because they were black and weren't supposed to go to the white school. So this was a case for them. So that is why Brown, they always use the last name of the main person that the case was brought for. So this was on behalf of Linda Brown and other African American children who were denied integration. The NAACP, which stands for National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, is a group that promotes education and advancement for black people, was a big help in getting this case together. So although segregation was declared unconstitutional, schools in the South were still voluntarily segregated for years. So they were told, you can't do this anymore, it's not legal, but it worked out that way anyway because there were so many other things in place in terms of communities and where people lived. People being afraid to go, that they didn't go to the schools once they could. So that became a problem. So even though it wasn't enforced, it still became the way people were living. All right, so until much later. Definition: Baker v. Carr, that's B-A-K-E-R, v. C-A-R-R, 1962, another court case. Reapportionment. Okay, that's just a term. To apportion something is to divide it up, like give portions. So when you reapportion, you change something. So reapportionment is the way that states draw their voting districts when populations change. And the way we draw districts, and remember we have representatives from every district that go to the Congress to represent the people. So like in our district, it's a certain area and it might be Democrat, Republican, and then when they come in and they do a census and their population changes, they sometimes move the district around, redraw the lines. Like, okay, now you're in this district. And that doesn't seem like a big deal, but it can be because it changes with the population. It might now be more Democrats, more Republicans. It changes then who ends up in office. It's one of those. So Charles Baker, in this case, lived in Tennessee, and he believed that the state should be redrawing their legislative district lines and that they weren't doing it because politically they didn't want to make the change. And he said that lack of action was in violation of the state constitution. Baker wanted a greater number of districts in the urban areas where more people lived because he believed his vote counted less. He thought his equal protection right of the 14th Amendment, we just talked about that using some of the other cases. Remember, they always go back to some of the amendments and cases in the past that help you understand it. So he said that if he's not being heard in terms of his vote, he's not getting equal protection under their rights because his voice isn't being heard, and so it's being violated. So the Supreme Court agreed and stated that the federal courts could hear cases and force states to redraw their district lines. It's political. It all has to do with moving lines to get your representatives to represent your group. Okay, another one is Westbury versus Sanders, and that's Wesberry v. Sanders, 1964. Supreme Court ruled that districts had to be of similar populations, so that it would be more along the lines of one person, one vote, as seen in the Baker case. I think it's good to know this. I don't think you would see a question about this on there. The redistricting isn't as important as knowing, I don't think, the Plessy versus Ferguson, the Board of Education, Brown versus Board of Education, the things that really had to do with the segregation laws, separate but equal, those you definitely need to know. Some of the other things you might need to know in the Warren Court, which would be the time that Warren was the Chief Justice, and that was 1953 to 1969. Generally speaking, overall, because the court makes people here, it's a big deal who's on the Supreme Court because it does change the laws of the land. Because the Supreme Court, that is the body that makes the laws of the land, that makes sure that the Constitution is being followed. All cases, if they go far enough, end up with the Supreme Court, and then their ruling is it. So some of the most important things during the Warren Court is that generally his court gave more rights to the accused. And these are some of the important things that came down that were on the side of people who were accused of a crime. Because remember, we always do want people who are accused of a crime to have a fair trial, a speedy trial, all the things that gives protection to citizens. And here are a few that are important. Miranda v. Arizona, another court case in 1966, and here you will hear Miranda rights. You always hear, did he get his Miranda rights? Even if you watch movies or TV and they take place in America, you will hear about the Miranda rights. And that is because Ernesto Miranda was a person who was charged with rape and kidnapping, and he was interrogated. He was asked a lot of questions. Because he didn't know that he had the right to remain silent, which is a right you have if you're arrested here, that you don't have to speak out. Remember the Fifth Amendment, you can say, I plead the Fifth. You do not have to give any information that's going to incriminate yourself. So you have a right to remain silent if you are talking to the police or something here. And he didn't know that he had that right. So the court said that he did not receive fair due process, which is you are supposed to receive fair due process. You have the right to remain quiet, to get an attorney, to not do anything that will incriminate yourself. So since those Fifth Amendment rights were violated because he did speak out against himself when somebody asked him, when he was interrogated and asked questions, he had to be retried because it made that one not work. So the controversy of the Warren Court, they then said that, so now the priority because of that was the ruling, was he had to be retried. Now, later on, he was arrested and tried, and I believe he did go to prison because he was guilty, but the idea was the process wasn't done correctly. So now they call it reading your Miranda rights. The rights were named after him because he's the one who spurred it on and got the attention. So now you'll hear people always say, did you read him his Miranda rights? And that's, if you watch any cop show, any movie where someone is arrested, they'll say you have the right to remain silent, you have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford one will be appointed to you. That's the Miranda, those are the Miranda rights. And that came from a case of somebody who didn't receive the right, the protection. It goes to the Supreme Court and they say, no, you can't do that. So now everyone gets their Miranda rights. And if you don't, then you would have cause for mistrial. You would probably not be convicted, just as he wasn't the first time, because that rule was broken, that law was broken. Okay, another one is Gideon v. Wainwright, and it's Gideon v. Wainwright, WAINWRIGHT, 1963. Clarence Gideon, again, the name of the person is always in the title of the court case. Clarence Gideon was accused of breaking into a billiards establishment, which is a pool hall. At his trial, he was denied the right to an attorney. He couldn't afford one. And because at that time, Florida only appointed lawyers, only gave you a free lawyer for murder cases, he didn't have a lawyer, and he was found guilty. The Warren Court later said that his rights were violated because his Sixth Amendment right, remember we have the Bill of Rights had all these very important amendments and rights, and that's how we got them. The Constitution passed was based on the fact there would be these 10 rights that everybody would have. So the Sixth Amendment was the right to the fair trial. It should have applied in the state of Florida because of the 14th Amendment due process clause. He was retried and acquitted, found not guilty. Mapp v. Ohio, M-A-P-P v. Ohio, 1961. Dolry, that's his name. Mapp, his house was searched in Ohio because the police were looking for a fugitive, a prisoner or somebody, and instead they found indecent pornographic materials that were against the law. It's against the law to have the pornographic materials, but since they had been in there for something else, they were looking for a fugitive. They weren't looking for crime against this person. They weren't looking for pornographic material. They didn't have a search warrant. They took the evidence and they convicted him of having pornographic material, which is illegal. The Supreme Court heard the case and ruled that the evidence couldn't be used in court. This was because of protection, again, of the Fourth Amendment, unreasonable search and seizures, applied to the states through the 14th Amendment's due process clause. So a lot of it goes back to the 14th Amendment due process and to those amendments in the Bill of Rights that make sure that you have a right to due process, fair hearing, you need to be heard and represented in court, you have the right, so there's no improper search or seizure. Somebody can't come into your house for one thing and then arrest you for something else that they happen to find while they're there. Those were all things that kind of, the courts in that case, the Warren Court is known for more rights to the accused, making sure that you have rights before you're convicted of something. All right. Here's a definition you need to know going back to the Brown v. Board of Education. Little Rock 9, 1957. Okay, after the Brown decision, the Brown v. Board of Education, which said that it was illegal to segregate schools, that there was separate but equal, did not work. After the Brown decision, the controversy broke out in Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. The media focused on the controversy here because 9 students were trying to go to school, and they were met by mobs of protesters, mobs of white people who did not want these black students to go to a white school. Governor Orville Faubus, F-A-U-B-U-S, called in the Arkansas Guard to support segregation. He did not want the black students to go to the white schools, even though the Supreme Court had said you have to. In the South, they were not having any of that. They still weren't going to go there. So they called in the Arkansas Guard to support the segregation. President Eisenhower, who was president at the time, had the final say as commander-in-chief of the Army and the chief executive of laws. That's what his job is, executor of laws, and also he's in charge of the Army. So he could send federal troops and the other one was the Arkansas Guard, or the state guard, state troops. So ultimately, federal troops forced integration. So it actually took the president sending down American troops, soldiers, to get the schools in the South to allow black children to go to white schools. Pretty sad. All right, definition of the I Have a Dream speech I told you about, and I'm sure you know this, 1963, Martin Luther King, very, very famous, very moving speech. If you haven't heard it, you should go online and listen to it. I'm sure there's a recording of it. I know there is. You can also read it, not quite as powerful as listening to his voice. Martin Luther King Jr., president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He delivered this speech on August 28, 1963 in Washington, D.C. Things to know about the speech. He gave it in front of the Lincoln Memorial. Important, visualize that. Lincoln was nicknamed the Great Emancipator. Remember this with the Civil War, Emancipation Proclamation. So Martin Luther King, who was fighting for the rights of black people all these years later, he gave his I Have a Dream speech in front of the Lincoln Memorial. He talked about and used some examples from the Declaration of Independence, saying that African Americans had been written a bad check, just basically a figurative language for when it came to the distribution of rights from 1776. And women used this same idea when they were trying to get rights at one of the first women's rights conventions, saying that when you go back to the Declaration of Independence in 1776, it will all seem to be about the rights of white men. So women didn't have the rights at that time, and Martin Luther King was saying, black African Americans didn't get a fair deal either. They were written a bad check when it came to the distribution of rights from 1776. He mainly spoke about the hope to see a world free of discrimination, where people of all races could live in harmony. I have a dream. If you listen to the speech or read it, he talks about a dream when his 4 children would live in a world that was free, and he goes on. You should read it or listen to it. Talked about people being judged by their character, not the color of their skin, and so anyway, he was assassinated 5 years later, 1968. King preached passive resistance or nonviolence. Furthermore, he and his followers practiced civil disobedience, refusing to obey an unjust law. And that's an important distinction. Civil disobedience is refusing to obey a law. It's not violent. He's not inciting riots. He's not promoting any kind of hatred. He's actually trying to passively resist, promote nonviolence, and practice civil disobedience. Okay, Civil Rights Act of 1964, super important, signed by President Johnson after a lengthy fight in the Senate and a very lengthy Senate filibuster. And a filibuster is just when they delay voting as long as they can, hoping that maybe people will stop trying to get something passed in Congress. So it's a technique of just trying to wait people out. So they filibuster, they talk for days and days and days to delay the vote. It finally happened. So President Johnson signed it, of course, and it ended all major forms of discrimination. It made it illegal to discriminate, and it made it illegal, segregation was then illegal. It made discrimination based on gender, race, religion, or national origin illegal. We take that for granted now a little bit, that is the way it should be, but that was a huge fight just even in 1964, and in the South especially. So in 1964, Civil Rights Act, remember President Johnson, and it made discrimination based on gender, race, religion, what else? National origin, all illegal. Still, even with that, even with the Civil Rights Act, even with the Supreme Court acts, civil rights were not absolute in Alabama. It was one of the last of the southern states. In 1965, SNCC and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the Black African groups that I told you about, they marched from Selma to Washington to Montgomery, demanding African voter registration rights, because at the time it was very difficult to get for Black people to be able to vote. So they marched from Selma to Montgomery, demanding African American voter registration rights. Along the way, they were met with people throwing tear gas and violence and fights from the Alabama state troopers. So Alabama's governing body, the troopers, the people in charge, were actually they were promoting violence and attacking with tear gas people who were peacefully protesting and marching from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. All they wanted was the right to vote, without all of the obstacles that were put in the way every time Black people in the South especially tried to vote. So that same year, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed. This reiterated, or kind of reminded people and impressed upon them and said again the wording of the 15th Amendment, which said you cannot prevent people from voting. So it's to prevent discrimination at the polls. So you have the Civil Rights Act of 1964, followed by the Voting Rights Act of 1965, both trying to get people in the South especially to understand that the years of treating Black people this way and the segregation had to come to an end. Right? Kerner Commission, Kerner Commission. In 1967, race riots broke out in Detroit. Riots had occurred in northern cities a year before, and President Lyndon Johnson appointed Illinois Governor Otto Kerner Jr., that's where the Kerner Commission comes in, to get to the bottom of the issues of what's causing all the riots. Kerner's commission offered the opinion that a separate but unequal Black and white nation was emerging, and measures should be taken to stop more violence. The idea was that, he says, you passed these laws that said that you can no longer discriminate, you cannot have segregation, but the fact is that in this country there is a separate and unequal Black and white nation that is emerging just from the way people are treated. And something needs to be done to prevent further violence. In 1968, rioting would again occur all over the North after the assassination of Martin Luther King. So Martin Luther King, amazing person who fought for Black rights, was shot and murdered. And of course, that angered people, and then more riots broke out. Okay, for another person you need to know, not for a great reason, but George Wallace. He was a governor of Alabama, and if you haven't figured out yet, Alabama was a very racist state. Did not want segregation or Black people to have any of the voting rights. George Wallace was a pro-segregation governor of Alabama. So he had a lot of power. He was governor of Alabama, and he wanted segregation. He wanted Blacks and whites to be separate, and he was not okay with the fact that it was no longer legal, that the Supreme Court had already said you can't do that. He personally tried to stop African American students from attending class at the University of Alabama, and he was not successful. But he was in there, and it was very violent, and he didn't have any problem with sending people in to cause violence to try to stop African American students from going to class. It's crazy. Wallace ran for president 4 times, 3 as a Democrat. Never got the nomination. In 1968, he ran for the far-right American Independence Party. He basically wanted a wall between the races, Black and white. He thought there was no reason for them to be together. So he was crazy. How were American Indians and Mexican Americans inspired by the Civil Rights Movement? We've talked a lot about African Americans. Remember, we still have American Indians or Native Americans who have been treated horribly since the beginning of since the colonists came. So they were also trying to gain rights and make some changes. So some of the things you might need to know about that is the American Indians began AIM, which stands for the American Indian Movement, and it tried to protect American Indian culture and also fight against racism, because the racism wasn't just against Black Americans; it was, against many different groups. AIM's interest was in creating jobs, helping to decrease poverty, and obtain fair treaties, because many of the Native Americans were on reservations or sovereign areas, so they still did have treaties. The movement also brought attention to hate crimes against American Indians. Um, and similarly, during the Civil Rights era, those of Mexican descent were also inspired by the Chicano movement. This was often led by young student protesters looking for education reform and racial justice, because we've talked a lot about African Americans, large population, the South, the Civil War, all of that. But there are also other groups that were not being treated fairly in education or employment or voting rights. So they were looking for a way to help people of Latin American descent establish a little more powerful voice and a voting bloc, and celebrate Hispanic culture and music and art. Around this time, Cesar Chavez, who I think we'll probably talk about a little bit later, emerged as someone who would help protect the rights of migrant farm workers, many of whom were Hispanic. So Cesar Chavez was a very important person mostly in California. I live in California, and I was raised during that time. And there were many years where our family did not eat lettuce, grapes, several things, because Cesar Chavez wanted people to boycott those to help the farm workers. And that's what my family did. So I do remember many years of that. Cesar Chavez was trying to get a fair deal for the migrant workers.